Elaine is one of those people I met almost a decade ago. She does remarkable things to make it happen. That's the easiest way to describe it. You've been behind more projects than you will admit during this presentation, but there are some people who actually do, and Elaine is one of those. Lots of us have ideas. This person carries it out. The floor's all yours, Elaine.
Very kind, Charles. Okay, so hi everybody. Pleasure to be here. My name's Elaine Gardiner. I'm the Head of Sustainability at Haglöfs. And just now you've been hearing a bit about the supply chain, the logistics end of the supply chain, and I'm going to touch a little bit more on the manufacturing part of the supply chain. And we'll kick that off with a little video.
The world is not yet on track to reduce emissions at the pace needed to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. So even though there is many things that need to slow down for the sake of our planet, the effort to stop climate change needs to go faster. We have developed a climate strategy to ensure we are part of the solution, not the problem. Of course, the production of our outdoor gear is where our biggest impact lies. That's why I'm particularly proud of the fact that our climate commitment covers not only the emissions from our own operations, but also includes the emissions generated from our full supply chain, from the extraction of raw materials all the way up until the delivery to our end consumers. This makes our targets very challenging, and we will need to look at every area of our business and beyond to get there, including increasing the use of lower impact materials, transitioning to renewable energy in production, ensuring that our products last longer, and exploring new business models. All of this while also engaging our end consumers and supporting stronger regulations to accelerate change. But it's going to take time to have an effect. That's why we have decided to speed up the process by taking responsibility for our emissions along the way and becoming climate neutral already in 2021. Now, climate neutral is a nice term, but it doesn't mean we don't have any carbon emissions. It means that we are compensating our own emissions by supporting projects that will hopefully avoid or reduce emissions faster than us. We think that feels a bit like cheating, but in this case we think it's justified to speed things up. The urgency of the climate crisis means we need to pull every lever we have available to us, and for now that includes offsetting. The important part is to ensure this doesn't get in the way of the real work of reducing our own emissions. To ensure we do this in the best way possible, we focus on purchasing only the highest quality carbon credits available on the market, verified to reduce emissions, while also providing extra benefits like jobs in local communities or protecting biodiversity. The projects we're currently supporting include renewable energy, reforestation, and forest protection. We will also work to transition any offsets which rely only on reducing emissions to ones which remove carbon from the atmosphere. At Haglöfs, we always think that the journey can be just as interesting as the destination. So we will keep you updated on our progress, talking honestly about climate neutrality and our road to net zero. We hope that you will join us along the way.
Basically, we launched our updated climate commitment earlier this year, and it comes in 3 steps. And what he was talking about there was our target to halve our emissions in the next 10 years, to get to net zero by 2030, and during that 10-year journey, take responsibility for the rest of the emissions along the way by climate compensating for that footprint. But really, the most important part of this whole commitment is that part number 1. It's the most important part and is the most challenging part. And we need to figure out how we are going to get there over the next 10 years. And it becomes more challenging because, Frederick sitting there as the CEO, he has growth demands that he needs to carry out for the business. Our business relies on selling more product to grow. Our product has a footprint. When we make more product, our footprint grows. So that 50% reduction, if we grow over the next 10 years, which we hope to do, will actually be a bigger reduction by the time we get to 2030. So it all mounts up, and it's a real big challenge for anybody that's making these type of commitments. So how do we get there? Well, we can start at a very high level. It's very clear we need to measure our impact so that we can make decisions about what we're doing and to show our progress. A very good place to start is to look at reducing our energy use in the first place. That seems quite obvious. We'll never get to zero energy use. We need energy to make our products. And in that case, we need to decide on what would be some better energy alternatives. And here we're obviously talking about renewable energy, reducing coal use, for example. And then when that's not enough, we can also look at ideas that would be capturing carbon from the atmosphere. So there's novel innovation, material innovations going around just now that are capturing CO2, making them into materials. We've got lots of talk of regenerative agriculture, which is hoping to capture more carbon than it emits. And there's lots of options out there. And of course, the whole journey is a lot smoother if we can count on consumers and governments to raise the bar for everybody along the way. But this is very general, and it doesn't really get down to the detail of actually what are the steps we need to take, what are the projects we need to engage in, and over the next 10 years. And so this is what we're trying to dig into a little bit today. And as we mentioned there, we start with data. So the very first thing to do is to look at our carbon footprint. And this is a Haglöfs 2020 carbon footprint. It's a total of about 20,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent. And what you're seeing here is scope 1 and 2, which is Haglöfs' own operations, our warehouses, our stores, our offices. And you can see it's insignificant compared to what is scope 3. And scope 3 is our manufacturing and logistics footprint, essentially. So this is telling us that switching off computer screens in the evening in your office is not going to cut it. We need to be focusing on where the big impacts are. And that's not to say there's no merit in working on your scope 1 and 2. There are obviously very good reasons to be working on that. But over the next 10 years, this is not where the majority of our resources is going to go. We really need to look at where the big impacts are, and that's in scope 3. So this is what our scope 3 footprint looks like, and I hope that most of you probably already understand this already, and that's that most of the impacts here are coming from the production of our materials. And that's very clear that that's where the impact is, and that's where we're going to have to focus going forward. An interesting statistic to pull out here is packaging. You can see up there at the top, it's actually relatively small. If you're going to, it's a hot topic just now, hot topic for consumers and governments, but it's actually from a climate impact point of view, it's a really small place and you shouldn't be focusing all your efforts on there. But much like scope 1 and 2, there are still merits to be working on packaging. There are other environmental impacts beyond climate change that are worth taking into consideration. And it's a really big first moment of truth. It's often the first point of contact that brands have with the consumers as an indication of commitments of brands to a wider program. But I digress. If we get back to materials where we want to concentrate on, that is where our biggest impact is today. And when we see these big numbers and we've got many materials peoples in the room, the first step is lower impact materials. And that's where we see a lot of the energy going into just now. And there's plenty of options out there. People are choosing recycled content, more natural fibers, bio-based synthetics. And you see lots of brands using more of these, putting out targets. At Haglöfs, our fall-winter 22 collection, so by fall next year, 60% of our styles will contain recycled content or renewable content. And this is all good progress and to be applauded, and it's going in the right direction. There's been a lot of development of materials, a lot of effort for brands to pull them through into the products, and that's great, and it's going in the right direction. but it's not going to help meet the targets in the way that we need. It's not the big step that's required. And the reason for that is that a polyester fabric, for example, 70% of its impact happens after the raw material stage, which in the case of polyester would be a plastic pellet. Whether the product is recycled, virgin, bio-based, all of those materials have to go through similar processes. They have to be made into a yarn. They have to be knitted or woven or dyed and cut and sewed into finished products. So there's this huge piece of manufacturing processes and steps that has to happen that has a much bigger impact on the overall impact of the fabric than the choice of the input material. In fact, the impact is so big that you could source a recycled polyester fabric that has a higher impact than a virgin recycled fabric because you're processing it in an inefficient mill. So we have to look at the whole picture, not just the input. So the point in here is that raw materials still need to be processed, and it's this processing that's going to have quite a big impact on our plans going forward. So when we think about that, all of these different steps in the processing, we try to think about, well, what are the specific actions? We know that that's where we need to look. We need some actions and steps that we need to take to make progress. And the first step or place to look would be to understand how energy is used in these factories. And at Tier 1, which is cut and sew factories, this is the data from Haglöfs supply chain, but is very typical actually of this industry. Most energy is from electricity use. And then the fuel that is used on site, most of that comes from coal. So already this guides us in a certain direction as to what we need to focus on. In this case, we need to be focusing on electricity use at Tier 1. But as soon as we move to different types of factories, the focus starts to change. Here you can see Tier 2, and this is fabric mills. The focus starts to change away from electricity towards the fuel that's used on site. And this is because they are more reliant on thermal energy in Tier 2 fabric mills, energy to heat water, create steam for processes like dyeing. And then you can see here that from the fuel used on site, a lot of that is actually coal. So already we're just looking at two different types of factories that are available in our supply chain, and our actions are actually going to be quite different, and the focus is going to be quite different on them. So there's not going to be one single lever that we can pull to make that big difference. This is going to be a work of lots of different actions to be taken along the way. So now we know what type of energy is used in the factories, but that's still not an action that we can take to start to reduce our impact. And we need to get deeper to understand what our options are here. Electricity is clearly a big topic at Tier 1. And one good question to be asked would be, what is the location of that factory? The grid electricity that factories are using differs wildly from country to country in terms of the impact of that electricity that's coming into the factory. Location of factories is going to become more important, not just from a closeness to market point of view, which is often being discussed just now, but actually in terms of your ability to meet your climate impacts. The current emissions factor for different countries is different, but also what is different is government commitment to policies and targets for reducing those further, and that's worth also understanding as you plan a longer-term sourcing strategy. If you've still got electricity use and it's not super low impact in the grid, you have a number of options that you can engage in to reduce your impact. And there is essentially four when we're talking about electricity. One option is energy attribute certificates, sometimes known as renewable energy certificates. And this is trading of certificates for the production of renewable energy, often market-based, regional-based, and they can be purchased. An easier to access option are supplier green tariffs, and you're probably all aware of these through your own electricity bills at home. Your electricity suppliers will give you an option for a green tariff. And essentially what they've done is they've bought these renewable energy certificates and passing that to the consumer because individual businesses and consumers don't have access to these bigger market mechanisms. You then have the option of course, of on-site energy production, solar panels being the most common one there, that's an option. Or for bigger commitments, there's the option to support, finance larger off-site renewable energy generation projects through purchasing contracts. And this is something you're seeing bigger brands like Microsoft or Google starting to do to cover their energy needs. So these are some of the options that are available, but they're not available everywhere. So another step has to be taken to further unpack that, to get clearer and more specific to your supply chain. And it's always worth looking at this at a local level specific to your factory. So Vietnam is a big sourcing country for many outdoor brands. So it's worth understanding what is actually available in Vietnam if we're going to start working with our suppliers. And it turns out there's not a lot of these options available, but there is government support and incentives for on-site distributed generation, usually solar panels. And we already see this because we see the most advanced suppliers in Vietnam already getting involved, already planning solar power energy. And that helps you to understand that, okay, if I'm not working with the most advanced suppliers, this is a good direction that I can help to move those suppliers towards. So we're starting to get into more concrete and actionable actions that we can actually do in our supply chain. But they have to be local and specific to where those factories actually are in the first place. So then we've talked about electricity. Probably in tier 1, they are factories with large roofs. You can get a large amount of solar energy out of those factories. They can cover a large amount of their electricity needs from that. As you start to move to other types of factories like tier 2, a fabric mill, for example, their energy use level is so much higher that the size of the roof is just not going to cut it. And you'll be lucky if you can get 10 to 15% of their electricity use from solar panels. So you're going to have to do lots of different small activities for all of this to add up. And in tier 2, we then start to talk about thermal energy. As we saw there, that's where a lot of the energy use is. And you can break that down into different activities. You can look at moving the fuel to a better fuel source. So in this case, coal is still heavily used in many factories, and we need to transition away from that. There's lots of options to improve energy efficiency in factories. And then there's just the choice of processes that we've done in those places. But one of the challenges here is that all of these individual actions are just going to move the needle small amounts in the right direction, but they're all going to be really small. And this is something you start figuring out, is that there is no one big activity that's actually going to fix this. You're going to have to engage in many, many different projects to get them to all add up to these big targets that are being committed to. So all of this is quite overwhelming. There is a lot of actions that need to be taken. And one thing becomes very clear. We need to get closer to our suppliers than ever before, closer than we are used to engaging and getting into a different level. But how you engage with those suppliers is very dependent on your leverage. And so understanding your leverage at different levels of the supply chain and with your different suppliers will also help to inform what options you have to act, right? And so your leverage really just is how big are you as a customer versus the size of the supplier. And you'll find that the lower down in your supply chain you go, the lower your leverage is and your options change. So when you have a high leverage, and this is probably at the tier 1 level of your supply chain, you really do have an option to engage with the supplier, to support them with technical or financial support, to do something like install solar panels, and that becomes an option. The further down you go, that's not going to be possible. And your best bet then is just to move towards those better suppliers in the first place and align your factory pool to one that is high performing. And a high performing supplier is going to be one that has strategies and policies and plans in place that are aligned with your roadmap and that will help to take you along that same path. Now there's options to move that leverage needle a little bit, and that might be collaboration. So there's a lot of projects that are working behind the scenes to collaborate together. So in the European Outdoor Group, for example, there's a climate action team where there's a lot of brands working together to share information about our supply chain and to pool finance to do energy efficiency projects in our factories. And that helps move the leverage because there's more of us and we can have better influence on that supply chain. So there's a lot going on there, and none of this we can do without data. And this is where we started. We started with the data question at the beginning, and it's going to be key to understand who are those high-performing suppliers. It's key to understand where the best actions are going to be and to be able to report against our progress. But there's real challenges with this data. And you might not be aware that actually most Scope 3 footprints that are being published at the moment are based off of very generic impact factors, which means that it's unlikely that you can see the result of a lot of those actions that you're taking in the supply chain. So for example, at the moment, if we buy more polyester next year, our impact will go up. If we buy less, our impact goes down. We won't see, if we buy polyester from a super efficient factory, we won't see that impact because we're using very generic impact factors. And that means over time, we really need to get better with our data. We need to get more granular in how we work with carbon footprints so that you can actually see these improvements in the supply chain. But this is very resource intensive, both for the brand side, but also from the factories gathering and sharing all that data. And this is where we need to look to more industry tools and technology to help make that balance between efficiency of collecting data and accuracy of getting that data, and that's going to be key. So we've touched on lots of different things here. We'll just summarize them very quickly, and then you might have some questions. So in order to build our roadmap to 2030 with some practical action steps, we really need to move beyond just material choice to the factories where those materials are made. So we're very used to sourcing materials and specifying a specific material, but we also need to think about those factories that come with that material when we're sourcing it now. We need to go a lot beyond that. There's going to be lots of different activities that need to be added up to get to that overall impact. And those activities are going to have to be differentiated by tier, by process and factory type, or else they won't make sense. They need to be appropriate to the location, because there's implications about what finance or support is available in those different locations. And then it's going to have to be appropriate to the leverage that you have, and that will be different depending on your supplier and depending on where you are in the supply chain. All of this is going to be impossible without much closer relationships with our suppliers. We need better understanding of the processes that are happening inside the factories. We need to learn more about energy use and energy markets, often skills that we don't have within the brands and within materials teams today. This is a whole other different level of knowledge and understanding. And we can see that suppliers that can provide a higher level of transparency and more data are going to be favored in a process of consolidation. We need to have more consolidated suppliers to make it more manageable in the first place, and also a really stable supply chain to make investments viable, right? We don't want to be engaging with a supplier we're only with for 6 months if we have a long-term plan there. And so we need a really appropriately sized and manageable supply chain for that, which sometimes goes in contradiction to some of this flexibility that we're going to be needing over time as well, and that will come up as a bit of a problem. But in general, what we're trying to say here is that, yeah, we already mentioned the data piece, but what we're trying to say here is that our climate commitments need to go way beyond just material choice and product design. Our climate commitments need to be fully integrated into our sourcing strategy and vice versa, or else we're not actually going to meet any of these targets. Thank you very much.
Elaine, that's fantastic. Thank you ever so much.